Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick video about diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. Obviously, that term has grown and evolved in recent years. Um, it's a long term, so now I think there's a little bit of confusion on what it really means, and maybe it's a little convoluted. So I just wanted to give some perspective. Diversity typically refers to the composition or the makeup of your employee population. So that's, looking at varieties in race, gender, sexual orientation, and things like that. So being diverse means that you've got a good mix of different types of people based on their various demographics. Um, Equity has typically been referred to as, inclusion. Let's start there. Inclusion has typically been referred to as people not only feeling like they're included, but really that there are systems in place to make people of different backgrounds feel that they're included in the organization, so that there's intentional effort. I think inclusion can be a little tricky to measure. Diversity is a little easier because it's a bit more matter of fact. If you're measuring what percentage of your population is of a certain racial group or the racial diversity or something like that, you can measure that pretty easily. Inclusion is something that you're probably more likely to get a person's perspective or feedback. How included or how inclusive do you feel that the organization is? A little harder to measure it in a more concrete way. Equity, I think, like diversity, is a little more measurable. So equity more so refers to, again, like the word equity itself, that in things like compensation, promotions, and things like that, that there's balanced results there. Some people would say that equity is more so about just creating an environment where everyone has a fair shot. And on the surface, I think that's fine. But again, if you want to talk about how you measure that and really determine it, I think you then have to talk a little more about some of the measurable outcomes. So, you'd have to look at things like, what percent, the compensation, salary compensation differences between men and women, or between, white employees and non-white employees, or whatever various types of measures you're using to look at equity. You could look at promotions, right? You could look at over the last 1, 2, or 3 years, who are the employees that got promoted, and then what are their what's their demographic composition, and you can see that if half of your employee population is female, half is male, but of your last 30 promotions, 25 of them were men, right? You would probably say, okay, something's going on. Let's look into that. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's discrimination right off the bat, but it definitely means that there's something you need to look into because you may have an equity issue. And then the last one is inclusion, which I think inclusion belonging, my bad, guys. I think belonging is a lot like inclusion, and that it can be a little harder to measure. And I think it's more so this sense, again, it's like this sense of belonging that employees feel that not only are they included in the organization and feel like the organization cares about them, but they truly feel that they belong there, that there's a culture and an environment that embraces people for who they are, and that people can be themselves and they can be authentic, and that they don't feel that they're outcasted or ostracized based on their various demographic identities. I know that sometimes I think those terms like inclusion and belonging can sometimes feel a little fluffy because they're harder to measure, and it's more about how people feel or interpret the environment to be. Whereas diversity and equity are a little easier to measure. Now, they may still have some controversy, but at least you can put more numbers to those things and quantify some of those outcomes. So that's diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. Who knows what will come next? But I think a question for you guys is, do you think that maybe we add a fifth letter and maybe that's O for outcomes? And this is just a question I want to pose to the audience. Do you think that diversity initiatives should be tied to societal outcomes, actual observable and measurable outcomes. And so what I mean by that is, if the majority of organizations in the United States really begin to develop diversity initiatives and programs, and you see more companies hiring D&I executives and managers and things like that, should these efforts be measurable on some of the social aspects that we measure success on, right? I use air quotes when I say success, but think about things like home ownership, right? There's a major gap in white home ownership rates and let's say black home ownership rates. Do you think that over the coming years, if companies are really investing in diversity and inclusion and all these great initiatives, should we see things like home ownership, the gap decrease? The value of home property, the property value for the average black home household versus the average white household, should we see that gap decrease? Net worth, the average net worth for a white household versus a black household, should we see that gap decrease? Should these things actually be impacted by these diversity and inclusion initiatives in the workplace? Or is there some other way to really say that it's worth it? Because at the end of the day, if people do report more diversity at work and there's more inclusion and equity and people feel like they belong, and there's success in those surveys and measurements on promotions and compensation packages and things like that, but we don't really see any shift in closing the wealth gap or the home ownership gap or education gaps and things like that, is it really working, right? How do we really determine that it's working if it's not having a bigger impact on society besides the sense of people feeling like there's progress being made? So just a thought for the crowd. I'm not telling you which way is right or wrong, but I'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not diversity initiatives holistically should truly have an impact, or really that their success should be measured on measurable and observable societal factors as well. So let me know what you guys think in the comment. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you don't like it. All the feedback is appreciated. You guys take care.